Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So, this is the Scott and Laci Peterson part 3. Hopefully it's the final part, but hey, I don't know until I'm recording it how many parts there's going to be. Thank you guys all so much for having my back and understanding what happened with part 2 and the demonetization of part 2 with the whole issue that's going on with YouTube. It's widespread. It's an epidemic. It's happening to a lot of creators. And if you're curious about what I'm talking about and you weren't on the live with me last night, so I'm recording this on Saturday, the live was on Friday, I will link the live in here so you can see and check it out for yourself and kind of figure out what I'm talking about if you're in the dark. So I am re-releasing part 2 today, which will be Sunday in the future, along with part 3 so that you guys can watch part 2 if you haven't. I had to edit it and take a clip out that I was demonetized for absolutely no reason and unfairly. But anyways, I had to take that out and I had to re-render it and re-upload it, which took quite a while, and it's going to be out Sunday along with this video too. So they'll both be released. You can watch them both. And I hope that it wasn't too inconvenient for you. If you're watching this and you've never been on a Friday Wine and True Crime with us, we have a lot of fun. We go live every Friday. We drink some wine, at least I do. I don't know what y'all are doing, but I drink some wine. And we talk true crime and life and YouTube stuff, and it's a lot of fun. So if you haven't been there, you should try to make it because we have a great time. Without further ado, let's just dive into part 3. I'm looking at how much content we have to cover in my notes, and I wonder if there's gonna be a part 4. We're gonna see. I'm gonna set the timer and see how long I'm recording for, but also set a timer so I don't sit on my feet and they don't fall asleep again. Okay, where we left off in part 2, Amber has just told Scott she doesn't think it's a good idea for them to talk until everything's sorted out, and he agrees with her so that he can, not be rejected because he can't stand to be rejected. He agrees with her, and they apparently break off communication. On February 18th, the cops search Scott Peterson's house again, and they take with them, this time, his new pickup truck, which they do return a few days later, but I'm over here laughing because it's almost like they're trying to mess with him at this point. He keeps buying new vehicles and they keep taking them from him. It's kind of funny. They still have his Ford F-150 in custody, and this truck will not be released until after he's been arrested, and then it's released into the custody of his parents. On March 6, 2003, the Modesto Police Department declared the Laci Peterson case a homicide, even though there's no body at this point. We're at a place now in the investigation where it's pretty clear that they are not focusing on any other suspects besides Scott. They definitely suspected him from the beginning. I do believe that. But at this point, they know that he had something to do with it, or they think they know he had something to do with it. So they're spending all their time and manpower now focusing on Scott as a suspect and trying to find Lacey and Connor. This next part of the video is about the discovery of Lacey and Connor Peterson's bodies. So if you're sensitive to this type of subject matter, I will try to be as respectful and as reserved as possible when describing how they were found and the condition they were found in, but it can still be upsetting to some people. So if you are sensitive to this kind of stuff, then I'll put a timestamp in the description box. So go ahead and pause the video now. Go in the description box to find the timestamp, and then you can just fast forward to that part of the video. On April 13th, 2013, a couple out walking their dog on the shore in Richmond, California, found the body of a late-term male fetus. He was lying in a marshy area of the San Francisco Bay Shore in Richmond Point Isabel Regional Shoreline Park. The next day, another person walking on the shore found the body of a pregnant woman wearing beige maternity pants and a maternity bra. She was washed up on the eastern rocky shoreline of the bay, just 1 mile away from where the baby's body had been found the day before. Autopsies were performed on these remains, and they were discovered to be the bodies of Laci and Connor Peterson. The condition of Lacey's body was absolutely horrific. She was missing her head, her forearms, and one of her feet. She was essentially just a torso when she was found. Connor's body was in surprisingly good condition considering how long they had been in the bay, or were thought to have been in the bay. He was less decomposed than his mother, and the coroner thought this was because he had been inside of Laci for so long while she was in the bay, and that even in death, her body had protected her son from the elements. So when Lacey went in the water, she was thought to have been still pregnant. And because of this, she would have been in the bay and exposed to the water and the sea life and all of that stuff in there for much longer than Connor, until her body would push Connor out in what is called a coffin birth. And a coffin birth is essentially when the gases in a decomposing body will expel the fetus from the body. There is no way to tell whether Connor had been alive when he had left Lacey's body or if he had died in utero, because both bodies were decomposed to the point where they couldn't distinguish what the cause of death was for either of them. Now, given medical science, it's pretty clear to me that Connor did not survive long after Lacey took her last breath, because if there's no circulation in the mother and she cannot deliver oxygen to the baby through her umbilical cord, the baby cannot survive for very long. And I believe they had both ceased to live when they went into the water, and her body just kind of acted as a shell and a protective source for Connor until eventually the gases of her decomposing body pushed him into the water, which could have been, several months later. And that is why he was in such better condition than she was. Lacey had 2 cracked ribs. All of her internal organs were missing except for her uterus. And she had been in the bay for so long, so many months, that there was actually marine life living inside of her torso. Okay, that part is over, so hopefully whoever skipped through and used the timestamp is now back with us. Hello, welcome back. April 18th is the day the autopsies were performed, and it is the same day that Scott Peterson was arrested for the murder of his wife and child. But just like everything else with Scott Peterson, his arrest could not be straightforward or easy. Obviously, Scott had admitted to fishing by Brooks Island the day his wife went missing, and the bodies of his wife and his son had showed up not far from that area. Literally, not far. Look at these maps. Okay, so as you can see, the red point on this map says Brook Island Regional Reserve. That's where Scott said he was fishing that day. If you take your finger or your eyes, whichever you prefer, and you move directly across to the right, there is Port Isabel Regional Shoreline. So how is it a coincidence that that's where Scott said he was that day? And right there is where Connor and Lacey were found. But Scott was trying to hide that he went fishing that day. He only came forward after people realized that he hadn't been golfing that day. Was that a coincidence? How could Lacey and Connor have shown up dead 80 miles away from their home that Scott and his defense team and his parents were claiming she'd been kidnapped from? How could she turn up 80 miles away from her home that she'd been kidnapped from and wash up right by where Scott was fishing the day they went missing? This is really no coincidence to me. How could anybody possibly believe that he had nothing to do with it? Add to that his weird behavior when the divers were searching Berkeley Marina and San Francisco Bay, and how he would go to check up on them, and his angry musings about how they were looking in the wrong place and he seemed to be agitated that they were looking there. It's pretty clear to anybody who's looking at the evidence available that Scott Peterson killed his wife and brought her to Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve, went out in his boat, and dumped her body into the bay. They tracked down Scott via his cell phone on a California freeway, and he was driving very quickly, like 80 miles an hour, and very erratically. The police decided, because of the safety for everybody on the road, they needed to just pull him over and end this. Now, I think they were following him for a while because they wanted to see if he was going to make a break for Mexico, because that's what they thought he was doing. They thought he was escaping and had heard the bodies had been discovered and was on his way to a different country to start a new life. So they were following him for quite a while. I think 5 hours they were trailing him to see where he was going. But I believe he knew he was being followed. He had been being followed by the police for months at this point. So he was once again trying to lose the tail of the police, and that's why he was driving so quickly and so erratically and swerving through traffic. Now, he had not received confirmation at this point that the baby and the woman who were found washed up on the shore of San Francisco Bay were Connor and Lacey. But, I mean, if he was the one who put them there, and a baby and a woman are washing up a day apart, a mile apart, it doesn't take much to connect the dots that this was Lacey and Connor. And everybody pretty much knew it was Lacey and Connor. They just needed confirmation from the autopsy. When they found Scott, he was in San Diego, only an hour away from Tijuana, Mexico, and he was speeding down the freeway. According to Scott, it wasn't what it looked like. He wasn't fleeing. Of course not. He had been spending a lot of time in San Diego recently. He was staying with some family he had there. He'd been chased out of his hometown of Modesto. He needed a place to stay, and he had family in San Diego that he could stay with. In fact, he even made a trip on February 3rd to Guadalajara, Mexico, and he came back February 7th. He'd already been back and forth to Mexico, he'd been in San Diego, he'd been in Los Angeles, and he'd never tried to make a run for the border yet. So why would he now? And I'm going to interject here with my own opinion and say a work trip to Mexico in February, when the bodies of your wife and son have not been discovered yet, is a lot different than an attempt to get across the border in April, the day after the bodies of a woman and a baby have washed up in San Francisco Bay. I would also add that if I was the calculated person I believe Scott Peterson to be, I may have used this work trip in February to set myself up in Mexico, maybe get an apartment, maybe stow some money away there, maybe open a bank account and get it prepared for when I had to leave California quickly and get to Mexico. When the police pulled Scott over, they found some odd things in his car. Come to think of it, the car he was driving was quite odd. It was a bright red Mercedes Benz. And I will tell you the story in a minute of how Scott came to be driving this vehicle. The story that Jackie and Scott Peterson tell, it's quite a tale. I'm sure it will entertain you. But anyways, in the car, they found camping equipment, survival gear, almost $15,000 in cash, several changes of clothes, 4 cell phones, some kind of dagger or knife, his brother's driver's license, 20 Viagra pills, and 200 sleeping pills. They also found a MapQuest printout of the area where Amber Fry lived. Okay, so here's Scott and Jackie Peterson's story of where the car came from, the Mercedes Benz, and why he happened to be in the possession of so much cash. So Scott's brother, John, was apparently going to take over payments on the new truck that Scott had just gotten a couple of months ago, the Dodge. And Jackie was going to loan John the money to buy out Scott. On April 8th, Jackie says she went to Bank of America and withdrew $10,000 of cash from an account she rarely used. And because she rarely used it, she didn't know the account number, so she just gave them her social security number. Allegedly, unbeknownst to her, she was still on Scott and Lacey's joint bank account. And when she gave the teller her social security number, the teller pulled up Scott and Lacey's bank account. Now, according to Scott and Jackie, Scott had opened this bank account years before with Jackie. And then when he got married to Lacey, he put Lacey on the account, but didn't remove Jackie from the account. So when she withdrew the $10,000, it apparently came out of this joint bank account that she was still on with Scott and Lacey, and not the random bank account that she didn't know the account number to, and apparently has just $10,000 sitting in it but rarely uses it. Jackie then paid Scott $8,000 for the equity on the Dodge, and she says she paid him in cash so he could use that cash to negotiate a better deal for a new car. On April 12th, the day before Connor was found, Scott purchased the Mercedes from a man named Michael Griffin. He paid this man with 36 $100 bills, leaving him $4,400 in cash left over from the $8,000 that his mother had given him. Scott then noticed the $10,000 withdrawal from his bank account and noticed it was his mother's signature on the withdrawal form, so he called her and asked her what happened, and she explained to him what happened. Jackie then goes to her own bank and withdraws $10,000 in cash to give Scott to pay him back for the $10,000 she'd mistakenly taken from his bank account, which left him with $14,440 in cash. She gave him this money on April 17th, and since April 18th was Good Friday and the banks were closed, and April 18th is the day he was arrested, he didn't have a chance to deposit the money back in his bank account, so he still had it on him. If you had almost $15,000 in cash though, and you knew the banks were closed on Friday and you wouldn't be able to deposit it, would you leave the $15,000 in your car? Or would you leave it in a house somewhere safer, maybe, until the banks opened and you could deposit it? So this story apparently has all the bank account forms and slips and everything to prove that this is how it happened. And I believe that's how it happened, but I don't believe that Jackie went to the bank and mistakenly withdrew $10,000 from the wrong account. I don't believe that. In fact, I probably believe more that Scott asked her to go withdraw the $10,000 so that she could give him the cash and it wouldn't look as if he was taking out that much money from his bank account. Because it would look suspicious if Scott was withdrawing massive amounts of money in cash from his bank account. But if his mother was the one doing it, then they could always go back and use this story that she had accidentally done it because she was still on the bank account. I think he knew very well that she was still on the bank account. I don't know if there's any way to find out if she was always on the bank account or if she had been added, recently, which would be more suspicious at that point. But either way, I wish I was a cop or a detective on this case because it's one of the things I would have looked for. So once again, according to Scott, he was not fleeing to Mexico. He was not in San Diego because it was so close to the Mexican border. He and his brother and his father were supposedly meeting at Torrey Pines golf course that day to play a round of golf on Good Friday. He said life had been so stressful, everything crazy had been going on. He just wanted a normal day with his family. And he wanted to do something he loved, which was play golf. At 7 that morning, he left his sister Susan's house where he'd been staying, and he stopped at his brother John's house to pick up the ID. And the reason he picked up John's driver's license, according to Scott, was because Laci Peterson had told him to stop and grab the license, because if they had the license, they could get a better deal at Torrey Pines golf course, because if you were a San Diego resident, you got a discount when you played golf there. As he's driving to the golf course, he senses he's being followed, and he thinks it's the media, and he does not want to lead the media to the golf course for them to get pictures of him and his family playing golf on Good Friday, the day after the bodies of a woman and a child had been discovered washed up on the shore. And for good reason. I mean, like I said, everybody pretty much knew this was Lacey and Connor. Scott had to have known this was Lacey and Connor, so yeah, the media following him would have been an issue. Because if they had gotten pictures of him playing golf and laughing and hanging out with his father the day after these bodies had been discovered, then it probably would have looked horrible. It was horrible. It's horrible. Can you imagine? You've been missing your wife and son for months, and then the two bodies wash up. It's clearly them. I mean, it hasn't been confirmed yet, but it's kind of obvious. And you decide to go play a round of golf the next day. I would have been distraught. I would have been standing at the police station waiting for confirmation of whether it was them or not. So Scott says he was driving fast and erratically to lose the media. And there is actually proof of a phone call he made to his brother Joe at that point where he said, I'm probably not going to make it to the golf course after all because the media is following me and I don't want to bring them there and I don't want them to get pictures of me playing golf and it's just something I don't need right now. After he gets off the phone with his brother, he continues to drive around for several hours trying to lose who he believes is the media following him, but they're actually unmarked police cars. Finally, not really knowing where else to go or what else to do, he does end up driving to Torrey Pines, and that's when the police pull him over and arrest him. Just as a point of reference, though, because I found this interesting, here is a map of Torrey Pines Golf Course to Tijuana, Mexico. It is literally only a 45-minute drive away, only 34 miles, so just thought I'd throw that out there. So here's the question, right? The contents in his car do make it look like Scott was somebody on the run. Yet his father backs him up and says, yes, they did have plans to play golf that day. And as soon as the sirens turned on and Scott realized it was the police following him, he pulled over right away. And what was he doing with the MapQuest printout of the area where Amber Frey lived? Some people think that he was planning to go there and kill her. She was basically his worst enemy at this point. Her coming forward made him look bad to everybody, and she was the one who would go on to testify against him and change the course of his trial. So some people believe he was trying to get a jump on the whole situation and maybe, end her life. I don't think this is the case. It would look bad or worse for Scott if Amber Frey turned up dead. I mean, pretty much everybody who already suspected him for what happened to Lacey would suspect that he had something to do with Amber, and he's trying to prove to everybody he's not a killer, so why would he go and kill his mistress? I almost think, if anything, He may have tried stopping at her place on the way to Mexico and made one last ditch effort to be with her and been like, hey, let's go. Get in my car. Let's go to Mexico. Get your kid. We'll start a new life. Because I think Scott was feeling pretty lonely and isolated at this point. And even though I don't believe he loved Amber, and I don't believe that he had plans of, marrying her or being with her forever, he probably just wanted somebody to go with him on this journey. Maybe he was going to kidnap her. I don't know. This is all speculation, but I don't think he was going to go and kill her. Scott Peterson isn't somebody who does things emotionally or on impulse. He's a planner. He's not an emotional person. Anything he does is clearly and concisely planned out. The police claim that Scott had also changed his appearance to be able to hide from the police. His normal dark brown hair had been bleached blonde. Scott claims that he did not dye his hair, that he was swimming a lot in a chlorinated pool and it had bleached his hair, which is absolutely ridiculous because I swim in a pool all summer and my hair doesn't come out blonde. He had grown a goatee, which was also very light, so he'd clearly lightened the facial hair on his face as well. And I mean, he was clearly trying to alter his appearance, but he had started altering his appearance and lightening his hair and growing a goatee, obviously months prior to this. You don't just grow a goatee overnight. So it wasn't as if he looked completely different than the police knew him to look, or the media even knew him to look. So I think that he might have altered his appearance to blend in and kind of stay away from the media, but I don't think it had anything to do with him trying to get away from the cops because they already had seen his appearance changing over the past couple of months. They were following him everywhere. They knew what he looked like, and I don't think it would have made too much of a difference. Scott also said the knife that was found in the car, which was found in the pocket of the door of the driver's side, had already been there when he purchased the car. And the man that he purchased the car from, Michael Griffin, he actually confirmed this. On April 21st, 2003, Scott Peterson was arraigned and charged on 2 counts of premeditated murder with special circumstances. The special circumstances part under California state law allows the state to seek the death penalty if the defendant is found guilty of the crimes. Before his arraignment, Scott was using the legal services of local attorney Kirk McAllister. But on May 2nd, 2003, Scott enlisted a much bigger gun in the legal department. Mark Geragos, a very high-powered Los Angeles attorney who has represented the likes of Chris Brown, Michael Jackson, Winona Ryder, he became Scott's lead counsel. On June 12, 2003, a gag order is placed on the participants of the case and the trial, which restricts them from discussing what's going on in the case with anybody outside of the other people who are involved in the case. This was in an attempt to give Scott a fair trial, even though his involvement had been so thoroughly speculated and publicized by the media that was going to be pretty impossible anyways. On September 26, 2003, Lacey's family filed a civil lawsuit against Scott Peterson, which would prevent him from ever being able to profit or make money off of the death of Lacey and Connor. So, for instance, he could never write a book about what happened and make money from it. He could never give an interview and make money from that. On October 29, 2003, the preliminary trial is held and the DNA and forensic evidence is presented. Now here's the evidence that the state had, and it is really all circumstantial. And we talked a little bit about circumstantial evidence in the Casey Anthony video. I will link that in the description box or here. If you haven't seen that yet, please go check that out after you finish this series. But circumstantial evidence is basically the opposite of direct evidence. Direct evidence is pretty much what it sounds like. A murder weapon is found with the fingerprints of the suspect on it. DNA is found on the body of the person who was murdered. An eyewitness saw the person kill somebody else. That is direct evidence, something that you can actually prove, and it's based on fact. Now, circumstantial evidence is evidence that allows the jury to determine a fact that can't be proven with other facts that can be proven. Circumstantial evidence in this case would include bizarre behavior after the fact. An eyewitness who thinks they saw Scott at the marina on the 24th, or an eyewitness who thinks they saw Lacey walking her dog on the morning of the 24th. Lying about an evidence, lying about an affair, lying about the timeline of that morning, things like that would be circumstantial evidence that the jury would then have to put together to come to a conclusion on their own without actual proof, looking them in the face, saying, here's a picture of this guy murdering this other guy. So at this point, they've got Scott lying about a couple of things. He lied about where he was that morning. At first, he told a lot of people he was going golfing, even after the fact. Even when he came home and didn't find her there, and he talked to Ron and Sharon on the phone, he said he'd been golfing that day. He told a couple of his friends he'd been golfing that day. He lied at first where he was the morning of the 24th. He also lied about having a mistress. The police had asked him directly, is there anything going on in your relationship that's not perfect? Are there any issues? And Scott said no. Scott lied again when he got up with Diane Sawyer and told her, oh yes, I already told the cops that I was having a relationship with Amber on the first night we talked, which was the 24th, and he never did that. The state also thought he lied about the entire timeline of December 24th. The state thought he had killed Laci the night of December 23rd because a lot of things about that morning apparently didn't add up. They said that they looked at the Martha Stewart show that Scott was talking about and there was no mention of meringue on there. They said that the jewelry Laci wore every day, never would leave the house without putting on this one necklace and this one ring, was sitting on the dresser. So why would she have gone to walk the dog without putting that jewelry on that she was seen with every day and would never leave the house without? And the beige maternity pants that Laci had been found in when she was dead were the same ones that her sister had said she'd worn the night before to the salon. So there was a lot of stuff that pointed to the state that Scott had killed her possibly on the night of the 23rd. They had also brought a police sniffer dog to the marina where Scott had been fishing on Christmas Eve a few days after Laci went missing, and the dog picked up Laci's scent there at the marina. On Scott Peterson's boat, there was found a pair of rusty pliers which had a piece of dark hair in the pliers. The hair was compared visually by an FBI analyst named Karen Cosberg, and she compared it to some hair that was found in Laci's hairbrush. Karen Cosberg concluded that the hair found in the pliers was consistent with the hair found in Laci's hairbrush and could not have been Scott Peterson's hair. Additionally, she sent the hair off to another FBI lab for a mitochondrial testing. This is also reminiscent of the Casey Anthony case because mitochondrial DNA testing is used when the root of the hair is not recovered. So you can't do actual DNA testing, and you can't prove actually that the hair came from that person because all you can really do is verify that the hair types are the same, and visually under a microscope they show the same kind of markings and coloring. You can also test the hair to see if it's been chemically altered or treated, like colored or permed, but you can only determine that the hair is consistent with a person. You can't prove that the hair came from that person. But I think it's safe to say that the hair did come from Laci Peterson. The boat was only 2 weeks old. The pliers did belong to Scott Peterson. They were his pliers and they were found in the boat. And the pliers were old and rusted, like they hadn't been used in quite some time. So why would he take some old and rusty pliers and put them in the boat that he just bought 2 weeks prior, and all of a sudden his missing wife's hair would be found in the pliers? Considering she was seasick the first time he ever took her on a boat, she didn't really like being on boats. I don't really see Laci Peterson at 8 months pregnant climbing onto a boat when she already gets seasick when she's not pregnant. Was it possible that the hair somehow got into the pliers before the pliers made their way to the boat? Yes, it's possible. And since the hair couldn't actually be proven to be Laci's, was only consistent with Laci's hair, it was just another piece of circumstantial evidence. They also found a cement-like substance on the wooden bed of Scott Peterson's boat trailer. They found a sledgehammer and a dustpan that was surrounded and covered in this white cement dust. The prosecution claimed that the cement dust, along with the 5 circular areas on Scott's boat trailer, showed that at some point Scott had made 5 homemade anchors out of cement. Scott had recently purchased a 90-pound bag of concrete from Home Depot, and he said he'd made 1 anchor for his boat. Boat anchors are actually very expensive, so it's not uncommon for people to make their own anchors or use some kind of other object as an anchor. However, they only recovered 1 cement anchor on Scott Peterson's boat, and the entire 90 pounds of concrete was used. So, where did the rest of the concrete go? Scott claimed he had used it to fill in some cracks in his driveway, and the driveway was tested, but the cement that was used to fill in those cracks did not match the cement that was on his boat, or the cement that was part of the anchor that Scott had made and they did recover. The prosecution would claim that those other 4 anchors that were made were used to weigh down Laci's body. That's why her body resurfaced in the condition it was found in, with her head missing and her limbs missing. Because if he had used the anchors to weigh her down, he would have put them on her limbs. And the weight of those anchors would have kept those parts of her body down. But after decomposition, with her body disintegrating in the way it does when it's in water, eventually the torso would have separated from those other parts of her body that were weighed down, and it would have come back up. And if he was only going to make 1 anchor, why would he have purchased so much concrete? Why not just at that point, if you're only making 1, buy an anchor? Because the kind of anchor he made, the weight that it was, you could buy one for 20 or 30 bucks. So why not save yourself the time and energy that it takes to make your own anchor and just spend 20, 30 bucks if you're only going to make 1 and buy 1 anchor? Additionally, the prosecution said the 1 anchor that Scott had in his boat wasn't enough weight to even hold the boat if he was stopping to fish like he said he was. That boat wouldn't have been able to be held down or still by the 1 anchor he had in the boat. So they don't believe he ever even stopped and anchored the boat in order to push her out of it. So that's pretty much all the evidence they had against him, which is not a lot. But when you add it to the lies of Amber Frey, the fact that he sold Laci's car, the fact that he looked into selling his home a month after his wife was missing. I mean, if your wife goes missing, why would you sell your home and leave? Wouldn't you want to stay in the house that the person who's missing from would know to come back to if they happen to escape their captors? Why wouldn't you want to be there? Why are you trying to sell the house? Now, he says he was trying to sell the house because the media was all over it and he just didn't want to live there anymore, which I guess makes sense. I can see that viewpoint, but it did look suspicious. Plus the items they found in his car when they arrested him, the prosecution thought they had enough to convict him. On December 3rd, Scott Peterson pled not guilty to all counts. After Mark Geragos took on the case, he immediately got to work and he submitted a change of venue motion. He said the pre-trial publicity had tainted the potential jury pool in Northern California, and to be fair, it had. The media, in typical media fashion, was more interested in printing stories that sold rather than printing actual facts. I mean, this case was sensationalized so much that actual legit media outlets were printing stories that Scott Peterson might have had something to do with the disappearance of college student Kristen Smart. Kristen had disappeared from San Luis Obispo on May 25th, 1996, while she was a student at Cal Poly. The only link between Kristen and Scott was that they attended the same school at the same time. Nothing else. And he was immediately ruled out as a suspect in the Kristen Smart disappearance, but the media still ran with it. It was a good story and it sold papers. And as far as the general public is concerned, they're not like you and me. They don't bother to look deeper into the facts for themselves. They're not like, this sounds strange, and, figure out, did Scott have anything to do with Kristen Smart? They just read the story because it's interesting, because it's a cool connection for people to think about, and they believe it. The trial was moved from Stanislaus County, where Modesto was, to San Mateo County, specifically Redwood City, California. Redwood City is about a 90-minute drive from Modesto and is considered part of the Bay Area. And I mean, at this point, there wasn't any place in California, maybe the United States, that Scott Peterson could have gone where he wasn't enemy number one. This story had made such national headlines. This story had been taken by the media and twisted so much that he really couldn't go anyplace and not have a jury pool that was tainted. But Redwood City really wasn't that far away from Modesto. Redwood City was closer to San Francisco, which was the media hub of the whole Bay Area. I guess the one positive for Scott in moving it to San Mateo County was that Redwood City didn't hold the hostilities that Modesto had, since Modesto was the place where Laci had grown up and lived and been very much loved and cared for. On March 4th, jury selection began for the Scott Peterson trial, and Scott would introduce himself to each group of potential jurors in the event that he didn't end up taking the stand in his own defense. This would have been the only time they'd have the opportunity to hear from him directly, and I'm sure he was hoping to dazzle them with his winning smile and his charm and show them, I'm just a nice guy, just your everyday average guy next door. Judge Alfred DeLucci asked each and every single potential juror, the question you have to ask yourself is if you would be able to vote to execute a human being. The jury questionnaire included questions about the potential jurors' opinions on extramarital affairs, their knowledge of boats, and what their current knowledge of the case was. And the decision was made to not sequester the jury, which I heavily disagree with. This case was so heavily publicized. So many people already had strong opinions about it one way or the other. The jury should have been sequestered for the entirety of the trial. The O.J. Simpson jury had been sequestered specifically because of the publicity that surrounded his trial so that they wouldn't be able to go out and talk to other people who already had opinions and be swayed one way or the other. This jury should have been sequestered. The jury was warned to not leave the courthouse and talk to anybody else about the case or to embark on research of their own outside of what they heard in trial. But come on, these are human beings, right? I know for a fact that if I was on that jury and I went home, I'd be right on my computer Googling the case. I would, because I'm curious and I want to know more. And you're going day by day by day, and every day you're leaving that trial with questions that the attorneys of either side haven't answered yet, and you are kind of impatient. You want to get answers. So it was kind of hard to believe, and nobody ever should have believed that these jurors were going to leave and go home and be little choir boys and girls and do everything correctly. 50% of the people who filled out the jury questionnaire said that they thought Scott Peterson was already guilty. And that's just the people who were honest about their opinions, not the people who lied on the jury questionnaire, which is quite common because sometimes people just want to get on the trial because they think this person's guilty and they want to make sure they pay for it. Now, when you're a defense attorney and you're sitting here and you're choosing jurors for your case, your ideal jury would consist of people who knew very little or nothing about the case. This was just not possible for this trial. A radio talk show in San Francisco, just 20 miles away from Redwood City, had actually purchased 2 ginormous billboards. They featured Scott Peterson in his orange jumpsuit with the words "man or monster" and a phone number urging listeners to call in with their vote on his innocence or guilt. The radio station also had another billboard on the back of a truck that they parked outside the courthouse where the trial was taking place every single day of the trial. The jury was finally picked and finalized on May 27th, almost 10 weeks after jury selection had begun. And as with most trials that are this heavily publicized, there was hundreds of people and media and spectators standing outside the courthouse in Redwood City every single day. The head prosecutor was Rick DiStasio, and in his opening statements he said, "This is common sense. If you think about it, it's pretty clear what happened here." Scott was unhappy with his life. He hated his job. He didn't want to be a father. He wanted to see other women and live a bachelor life and travel around. And he solved his problem in the easiest way he knew how, by getting rid of his wife. This is pretty much what the police thought in the Chris Watts case as well. This was a man, Chris, who was working at a job that his wife had kind of forced him into taking to provide for their family when all he really wanted to do was be a car mechanic. This was a man who was dating other women and seeing other women on the side, and whose wife was now pregnant with another child that he would have to provide for, and he just didn't want to deal with any of it, so he exterminated his entire family. And this is where the similarities between Scott Peterson and Chris Watts continue. DiStasio told the jury about Scott's affair with Amber Frey, and he also went over the circumstantial evidence, painting a very clear picture for the jury of what had happened that day and in the months following. However, he never came straight out and said, Scott Peterson is a murderer. Scott Peterson is a cold-blooded murderer. In fact, his presence in the courtroom was pretty weak. Seasoned prosecutors afterwards would say they could never understand why he never said, this man's a murderer. This man's a killer. It was basically prosecution 101, that when you were trying to get a jury to see that somebody was a murderer, you called them a murderer, and he never did that. Some referred to the 4 hours of his opening statement as rambling and dispassionate, leaving the jurors a little bit on the fence. One juror would later say that he felt the prosecution was shooting in the dark. Then Geragos gets up for his opening statements, and his courtroom style is the exact opposite of DeStasio. He's a showman. He's putting on a show for the jury. It reminded me a lot of the trial of Casey Anthony, where you had the prosecutors who were kind of, boring to listen to. And then you had Jose Baez get up there, and he was charismatic, and he was smiling at the jury and making them feel heard and important. And he was basically putting on an entire Broadway show for the jury. That's what happened pretty much in this case. And Geragos said, "My client, without a doubt, is not guilty. He did not do this to his wife, an unborn child. Is he a philanderer? Yes, he's a man that cheated on his wife, but that does not make him a murderer." He said the police and prosecution were railroading Scott, that they hadn't focused on any other suspects since day one. He said he had multiple eyewitnesses that the jury would hear from that had seen Laci walking her dog on the morning of December 24th, which meant that Scott couldn't have done this at all. The prosecution put many witnesses on the stand who would testify to Scott's indifference to the disappearance of his wife and unborn child, including Laci's cousin, Harvey Kemple. Kemple claimed that he thought Scott was more concerned with the police going into his home than he was with where Lacey and Connor were. Geragos countered these statements with, "It's impossible to put a standard on how somebody should act or behave in a crisis." And I do agree with him on this point. Everybody is different, and everybody handles stress and trauma differently. Some people are very openly emotional about it, and some people almost shut down to protect themselves from what's happening. Sometimes people pull within themselves and withdraw from what's happening on the outside so that they don't feel it because it's too much for them to feel. People who react to traumatic situations in this way can appear to be cold and distant, but Scott wasn't just cold and distant, was he? He was actively pursuing another woman in the days and weeks and months following his wife's disappearance. He wasn't shut down within himself, keeping away from everybody. He was calling Amber Frey almost every day, talking about their future, talking about their relationship, talking about how much, she meant to him, calling her sweetie and babe. That's not a man that's cold and distant. That's a man that doesn't care his wife is missing. I mean, come on, guys. I'm here with an open mind. I really am. But December 31st, New Year's Eve, candlelight vigils going on for your wife and your baby who are gone. And Scott's on the phone with Amber, creating this whole Paris Eiffel Tower fireworks story for her. I mean, he's got these made-up names for the people he's with. Amber asks him, "Oh, who's the friend that you were with? Francois, what was his name?" And Scott's like, "It's Francois, Amber. I'm with my friend Francois in Paris, France." Like, you picked the most generic French name to assign to your fake French friend. And you're creating this entire story about where you are and what you see, what's happening. The fireworks are beautiful over the Eiffel Tower, Amber. You should be here. I wish you were here. Someday we will do this together. And he's creating this entire narrative that doesn't include the wife and the child that he's lost. There's a difference between being cold and distant to everybody because your brain's in shock, and being just indifferent and not caring that your wife, who's pregnant with your first son, is missing because you don't care, because you know where she is, because you put her there. They went over the timeline of Christmas Eve, and they put Modesto police officers on the stand who had dealt with Scott in the early days of Laci's disappearance. The police officer said he was probably out on the bay that day, but he wasn't fishing. He couldn't remember what bait he was using. He couldn't remember what kind of fish he was fishing for. He clearly didn't really know much about fishing, so they did not believe that he was out there fishing. They also brought up the secret boat, how it had been purchased just 2 weeks before Laci went missing. And Scott, who actually owned 4 laptop computers. Do you believe this? The guy's got 4 cell phones and 4 laptop computers. Who needs that many phones and computers? Somebody who has something to hide, in my opinion, but don't come for me. Anyways, they took all 4 of these laptops into custody and looked at them, and they saw that on December 7th, Scott had been trolling the classified ads for boats. December 7th was the day that Amber's friend confronted Scott and said, I know you're married, and I'm going to tell Amber if you don't. The same day, Scott went looking for boats. The next day, December 8th, he pulled up websites with fishing reports, water conditions, water currents for the San Francisco Bay. And the maps he pulled up were actually clickable so you could zoom in on a certain area, and Scott zoomed in right around the area of Brooks Island. A hydrologist from the U.S. Geological Survey testified that the place where Lacey and Connor had washed up would indicate that they were probably put in the water right around this place where Scott says he was fishing that day and where he was zooming in on the map on these water current maps. So I don't know if I have to say this, but in my opinion, he was clearly looking up water currents to see the best place that he could drop Lacey's body in the water where it would be swept out to sea and not wash up on shore. But apparently he's as good of a water current reader as he is a fisherman, because that didn't happen. Then a friend of Scott's, Greg Reed, took the stand. Greg had been a friend of Scott's for a little while. He lived in the same neighborhood as Greg and Lacey. Lacey and Greg's wife were friends, so he was pretty familiar with the couple. Greg testified that Scott Peterson had called him on the afternoon of the 24th, frantically asking him if Greg or his wife had seen Lacey that morning or the day before. Greg also claims that Scott mentioned nothing about fishing. So why is Scott asking Greg if they've seen Lacey that morning or the day before, if Scott claims he saw her that morning? At the point that Greg took the stand, Scott Peterson stopped rifling through papers and staring down at the table in front of him, and stared directly at Greg throughout his entire testimony. Greg did also say something, though, that didn't really help the prosecution. He said he had been at the Peterson home when Lacey was missing, and the police showed up. And within an hour of the police being there, he said he heard them say, well, we already know what happened, indicating that they already thought Scott had done something and that he was guilty, which would support the defense's statement that the cops had tunnel vision on Scott from day one and weren't really looking into any other suspects. To me, though, I think this is just how policemen work. They're pretty good at their jobs. They're trained, for the most part, to be able to sniff out a liar and to be able to see when a situation's not right. 9 times out of 10, if a woman is killed or goes missing, it's her husband or boyfriend or partner who's involved, and they, were saying what they thought, which was, we think the husband did it. Another blow to the prosecution's theory that Scott was not happy about becoming a father was Greg actually did testify that he and Scott were looking through one of those catalogs, like an outdoorsy catalog, and there was kids' clothes and camo and stuff like that in there. And Scott made the statement he couldn't wait for his son to be born so he could dress him in this kind of camo outdoors gear. Geragos questioned members of the Modesto Police Department and asked them if they had looked into other possible suspects besides Scott, like the homeless. There was a pretty well-known homeless population who liked to sleep in the park where Lacey was known to walk her dog every day. And so Geragos was basically alluding to the fact that Lacey could have been kidnapped or harmed by a homeless person. A huge discovery, for me at least, was when Detective Al Brocchini was put on the stand. He was questioned by Geragos about Scott's secret boat and warehouse, and everybody claimed that nobody but Scott knew about the boat. Lacey didn't know, Lacey's family didn't know, even Scott's family didn't know about the boat. But Geragos brought in an eyewitness who claimed to have seen Lacey at the warehouse either December 23rd or December 22nd. And this witness says he saw Lacey there, that she was very pregnant, and she asked to use the bathroom. Scott claimed that Lacey did, in fact, know about the boat, that they had both agreed to purchase it as a present for his stepfather, Ron Gransky. Now, Ron was actually an avid fisherman, but he does not believe that boat was ever meant for him since he already had a fishing boat that he used often, and it was a very nice fishing boat. Ron was also very vocal the entire time about how he thought it was ridiculous that Scott went fishing alone on Christmas Eve. But then it came out in court that Ron himself had gone out fishing alone on Christmas Eve. Lee Peterson and Ron Gransky would have a verbal altercation that day after this testimony when they were both leaving the courthouse. They were going down the escalator. I believe that Lee Peterson was going up the escalator and Ron Gransky was going down the escalator. And Lee Peterson looked over to him and said, "So where did you go fishing that morning?" I think he was maybe trying to suggest that Ron had something to do with Lacey's disappearance, or at least would have had as much to do, or would have been as suspicious of having as much to do with Lacey's disappearance as Scott was. And Ron, who was now at the bottom of the escalator, looked up at him and said, "If you come down here, I'll tell you where I went fishing that day." Anyways, back to Al Brocchini on the stand. He was asked by Geragos if he had interviewed the person who claimed they'd seen Lacey at the warehouse, and Brocchini said he had. And Geragos said, "Well, why isn't it in your report? Did you leave this out of your report?" And Brocchini said he had. So Mark Geragos put forth the theory that Al Brocchini had purposely left out the testimony of this eyewitness in his report, because if it showed that Lacey had been at the warehouse, she would have known about the boat. It wouldn't have been a secret boat. So their whole theory that Scott had secretly and specifically bought this boat without telling anybody so he could use it to dump Lacey's body into the bay would have been a little bit questionable. Brocchini claims that another detective who had been with him included this evidence in his report. Brocchini also said that he had included the eyewitness statement in a taped transcript of that interview, which he had handed over to the defense. So they had knowledge that he knew about it. And they also had the taped transcript, which he had talked about the eyewitness testimony in it. So he wasn't trying to hide it. And I don't believe he was trying to hide it. I believe he thought Scott was guilty. I believe he probably wasn't much of a fan of any evidence that would make it look as if Scott wasn't. But there's no real proof here that he specifically excluded it from his report in order to hide the fact that this person existed. If it was in fact in another police officer's report, and if it was in fact in a taped transcript of his report that he gave to the defense, he was not trying to hide it. But at this point, the prosecution's case was not looking strong, and people began to believe that Scott Peterson would get away with this or not be found guilty, whatever you want to believe. They thought it was going to be like another O.J. Simpson. It really seemed as if the defense had the upper hand in the trial for a long time. Every single thing the prosecution brought up, Geragos would shoot down with a healthy dose of reasonable doubt. But then June 30th came, and Sean Sibley took the stand. Now, Sean Sibley was the friend that Scott had initially met, and then who introduced him to Amber. They'd met at a trade show in October of 2002, and Scott and Sean were not the only people who were present for their verbal exchanges or their conversations that they had that Sean testified about. A man named Eric Olson, who had been an employee at the time of Scott's, had actually traveled with Scott to this convention. Scott and Eric were actually introduced to Sean Sibley by a friend of Eric's named David Fernandez. All four of them, Eric, David, Sean, and Scott, went to get drinks and dinner that night, and it seemed as if Sean and Scott were really hitting it off. Eric said that he thought the interaction between the two was very inappropriate for a married man and a woman who was engaged. And eventually, the conversation turned sexual, which made Eric and David both very uncomfortable. With the opening that Sean Sibley's testimony had given them, prosecutors came at Scott hard and said that Amber Frey wasn't the first girlfriend or extramarital affair that Scott had had. Sharon Rocha even testified and said that Scott had been unfaithful to Lacey at least 2 times during their marriage, and that Lacey knew about at least one of them. 2 different women had called the Modesto Police Department to reveal that they had been involved with Scott during his time at Cal Poly while he had been married to Laci Peterson. They both said he never told them he was married. The first girl found out he was married when she literally saw them together on campus. And the second girl said she found out at a graduation ceremony when Lacey walked up to Scott and put a lei around his neck, and Scott introduced Lacey as his wife. Another one of Lacey's sisters, Rose, testified that when Lacey became pregnant, Scott jokingly said, "I was hoping for infertility." But I do believe the actual turning point for the jury was Amber Frey's testimony and the taped conversations that were played for everybody in the courtroom. Amber got up and she spilled the tea, all the cringy details. Then the calls played and the jury got a first-hand look at the way Scott Peterson was talking to his girlfriend in the days after his wife was missing. The prosecution put up 2 pictures side by side. One picture was of Scott and Amber Frey at her company Christmas party, and they were holding each other, clearly together in a relationship. The other picture was taken the same night, and it was of Laci Peterson, pregnant and alone, at a different Christmas party, miles away. The emotional pull of this visual representation was undeniable. You've got beautiful, smiling, pregnant Laci carrying Scott's child with clearly no idea that her husband, that very same night, probably at that same moment, had his arms wrapped around another woman. That the reason he wasn't with her at this Christmas party, and he told her he had to go out of town for work, the reason he was with another woman at a different Christmas party was because he didn't want to be with Laci. He wanted to be with Amber. Then the New Year's Eve calls to Amber during the vigil. You could have probably heard a pin drop in the room. This was literally audible proof that Scott at this point was more concerned about saving his relationship with Amber than he was with finding his wife. Of course, Geragos gets up after this and he's like, it's a fling, it's nothing, it was just a distraction. He never once told her he loved her. She didn't mean anything to him, but the damage was done. The jury had seen and heard for themselves that Scott was a liar, a compulsive, practiced liar. And if he could lie about all of this so easily, what else was he lying about? What else could he lie about? On June 18th, Brent Rocha, Laci's brother, and Justin Falconer, juror number 5, they were exiting the courthouse at the same time. And Justin Falconer made a little side comment, kind of a joke, to Brent Rocha and said, I'm about to ruin the shot for the news tonight. You're not going to be on TV tonight. And he was removed from the jury for this. Now, I don't believe that Justin should have been removed from the jury for this. You're not supposed to, as a juror on a trial, talk to the victim's family or the defendant's family, but they were walking out of the courthouse at the same time. He said that he was going to ruin the shot and that Brent wasn't going to be on TV that night because if he happened to be walking out of the courthouse at the same time as Brent, the media could not post those pictures or use them in any way because they could never use anything that had a member of the jury in it. Technically, Justin could have been removed for even saying something to Brent like, I'm sorry about what happened to your sister, because it would show sympathy for the family of the victim. But I think he was just trying to be kind. You know, the media surrounding this whole thing was probably annoying and intrusive to everybody. The family of Laci and Scott were on the news all the time, walking in and out of the courtroom, trying to avoid the media. And Justin was probably just trying to be kind and show that, you know, he did feel bad about Brent's sister being dead. He probably was just trying to help Brent out and walk out with him at the same time so that for at least one day, Brent could avoid having his picture or a video of him leaving the courthouse put on every single news outlet station. But Justin Falconer was replaced by another man named Gregory Jackson. When the autopsy pictures of Lacey and Connor were displayed to the jury, the Rocha family and Scott Peterson asked to not be present during this testimony. Now, Scott was present during the pictures being shown, and according to one juror, he would look away when pictures of Connor were being shown, but when pictures of Laci were shown, he stared at them before looking away. I don't know what that means. You come to your own conclusions about what that means. However, during the pictures of the bodies being shown in the testimony to follow, both Jackie and Lee Peterson chose to stay in the courtroom and witness and hear everything. Laci's family left. They could not stomach to see these things or hear what condition the bodies of their daughter and grandson were in, but Jackie and Lee Peterson chose to remain in the courtroom during the whole thing. Now, obviously, these pictures would be gruesome and emotionally upsetting to anybody, even a stranger, who had never known Laci in life. But I can't imagine being somebody who knew Laci when she was alive, being somebody who was the grandparent of the baby in question, being able to sit there and see the pictures and hear the testimony. The state also played some home video of Laci Peterson. She was very vibrant, full of life, cooking in her kitchen, laughing, smiling, dancing around. This was the first time the jury would be able to see Laci as an actual person, a living, breathing, smiling person. And this hit home for a lot of them, especially after seeing her autopsy pictures. They had to now try to connect how this smiling, full of joy woman preparing a meal in her kitchen had become this lifeless, headless corpse that was pulled out of the bay. The prosecution laid it out very simply. Laci was pregnant, and Scott believed that having a child would get in the way of his bachelor life. Laci would start to expect more from him as a father, expect him to be home more. This would get in the way of his traveling to conventions for work and being able to have relationships with other women, and he just didn't want that to happen. So he killed her by either strangling or smothering her, and then he put her in his boat and went out into the bay, into a place where he thought the current would take her away, and dumped her lifeless body into the water along with his child. A big blow to the state, although I don't think it should have been, but it was a big deal, was they kept saying that this had happened on December 23rd, that he'd killed her on December 23rd and he dumped her body on December 24th, and that he lied about the timeline of December 24th. And a big part of their evidence that proved he had been lying about what happened on the 24th was that Martha Stewart wasn't talking about meringue on her show. Then Mark Geragos plays the episode where literally Martha Stewart is sitting there talking about making lemon meringue cookies. And why would Scott Peterson have been watching Martha Stewart making lemon meringue cookies on December 24th if his wife hadn't been there with him? They also pulled up internet records from the Petersons' home computer. Someone in the home that morning had been online shopping for a scarf and an umbrella with flowers on it. And the defense said, why is Scott Peterson, when he's supposed to be killing his wife or dumping her body, on the home computer looking up flowered umbrellas and red women's scarves? Finally, we're going to talk about the theories that the defense had and who could have done this besides Scott Peterson. 6 months before Laci Peterson disappeared, a 24-year-old woman who lived in San Francisco named Evelyn Hernandez disappeared along with her 5-year-old son a week before she was supposed to give birth. Her torso was found in San Francisco Bay in August, and her son Alex was never found. Evelyn was a legal immigrant working as a nurse. She was a devoted and loving mother to her son, and she was reported missing by her 36-year-old married boyfriend, not married to her. Geragos tried to connect these two cases, as well as some other cases of missing pregnant women in the area that actually turned out to be completely different circumstances and not connected at all. But he tried to connect all these cases, saying there was a satanic cult out there who went after pregnant women to sacrifice them and their babies to the devil. I was obviously very surprised that the Evelyn Hernandez case, which happened before Laci's disappearance, did not get as much media coverage, if any media coverage, because Laci's disappearance had gotten so much. And I have my own theories for why this is, but I'm not going to disclose them at this point because I don't want this to turn into a politically fueled discussion, but you can draw your own conclusions from that. However, the fact is, if you look at these two cases, yes, they are very similar, but not in the way where the same person committed them. Unfortunately, both women were pregnant by men who probably didn't want to be fathers, or the arrival of this new baby would affect them negatively in some way. The father of Evelyn's baby was married to somebody else, so I can't imagine it would have been helpful for him to have another woman give birth to his child. Probably thought that might have maybe had some negative effect on his marriage. And I obviously don't know this for a fact. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but what seems to be more troubling here is how common it is for men to kill their pregnant girlfriends or spouses or significant others. Why is this a thing? Evelyn Hernandez, Laci Peterson, Shanann Watts, why is this a thing? Unfortunately, it seems like too many men just decide that the solution to their problem of having a woman pregnant with your child is to kill them both. Now, obviously, I already told you that Mark Geragos thought that Laci had been kidnapped by Satanists, but let's go a little deeper into that. I guess in the Modesto area at that time, the hot button issue was Satanists. And there had been some satanic cults around the area that people had been concerned about, or kids who were practicing the occult. In 1990, in Salada, California, just an 11-minute drive from Modesto, a paramilitary cult who called themselves Children of Satan or Children of the Night, led by a man who was deeply interested in the occult, went to a home on Elm Street and brutally murdered 4 people. Scott's defense team also found some graffiti art in the San Francisco Bay Area, not far from where Lacey and Connor were discovered, that portrayed a woman with no hands, a baby with its umbilical cord still attached in water. And one of the lawyers who worked on the Salida case said that one of the cult members told him sacrificing a newborn baby was one of the most cleaningest things you could do as a Satanist. Cleaningest is their word, not mine, because I am aware it is not a word. And Christmas Eve is apparently a popular satanic holiday that they call the Grand High Climax. They even went so far as to say the street where Lacey and Scott lived, called Covina Avenue, had the word coven in it, which means a group of witches. Additionally, in mid-December, a woman reported being kidnapped and sexually assaulted by Satanists, and she claims they told her they were going to commit a murder on Christmas Eve and that she would hear about it on the news. Now, this woman was not a really reliable witness. She had also contacted the Globe as well as the police trying to sell her story, and her husband said that she had been struggling with some mental instability issues for quite some time. Connor had been found with a small piece of electrical tape on his ear and some kind of plastic tape wound around his neck 1.5 times, with the end being like a little bit longer, almost like a noose. The defense team claimed that Lacey had been kidnapped when she was still pregnant, so that when she gave birth, the Satanists could sacrifice her and her baby to the devil and become clean. It's so ridiculous, I don't even want to say it. The prosecution said the tape found on Connor was just some trash from San Francisco Bay, which is quite polluted, that had just unfortunately attached to the poor baby. And this brought the defense team full circle back to the brown van that some residents of Covina Ave and the neighborhoods around Laci Peterson's home said they'd seen the sketchy brown van in the area. And, the police actually tracked down the sketchy brown van to a trailer park and found that it was just, some people who were not at all connected to Laci Peterson. But Geragos claimed that the man who owned the van was a known meth dealer who had satanic connections. I mean, what does satanic connections mean? How do you discern whether somebody does or does not have satanic connections? What expert do you bring in to question somebody to determine what their satanic connections are or aren't? At the beginning of November 2004, closing statements are made and the jury began to deliberate. On November 9th, another juror was dismissed, juror number 7, named Frances Gorman. It had been discovered that she'd gone home and done some research on her home computer about the case. Surprise, surprise, I guarantee you she wasn't the only person who did. She was just probably the only person who got caught. On November 10th, another juror was removed, Gregory Jackson, juror number 5. He had actually replaced the original juror number 5, who had been dismissed for talking to Brent Rocha. He had just been voted jury foreman on the 3rd, an easy choice for the jury because he had degrees in medicine and law. He was actually a lawyer. He was a corporate attorney, and he spent much of his lunch break answering emails and talking on his BlackBerry, not really making connections or friendships with the other juror members, but they still trusted his expertise in these areas and thought he was the best, choice for a foreman. He was a detailed note taker, and over the course of the trial, even coming in a little bit late, he had filled up 19 notebooks, page to page, on his observations and details from the case. Eventually, his attention to detail caused some issues in the jury. Day after day after day during deliberation, he wanted them to keep going over every little minute detail and talk about it and get to the bottom of it. And after the 3rd day of deliberations, when it appeared almost all of them were leaning towards a guilty conviction, he tried to talk them out of it, saying wait, we haven't gone over all the evidence. We didn't check everything out. What about this? What about this? What about this? Eventually, the jury admits to having turned on him with their main goal to get him off the jury because he was making them go over the case too closely. And after pretty much being bullied by the jury for a couple of days, he told the judge he wanted off. He said he had never been around such a group of argumentative people, and it was just becoming too much for him. During the trial, Scott Peterson's appearance changed drastically. When the trial first started, Scott looked like his normal self, except with bleached hair and a goatee. But a couple months in, the jury noticed that he had lost like 40 pounds and his hair had turned back to its normal dark brown color, but he didn't look good. He looked gaunt. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. Apparently, prison was not kind to Scott Peterson. And on November 12th, 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder of his wife and second-degree murder of his son, Connor. On November 30th, the penalty phase of the trial begins. And this is the phase, basically, where the judge and the jury will decide what kind of sentence Scott will receive. Sharon Rocha got up on the stand and faced her son-in-law for the first time. She made a very emotional statement about her daughter and her grandson. And she looked at Scott and said, divorce was an option. You didn't have to kill them. She talked about the days and the weeks and the months spent searching for her daughter and worried about her daughter and her grandson and not knowing if they were okay. And she actually screamed at Scott, you knew where they were the whole time and you let us go through this. Sharon recounted the moments before her daughter and her grandson's funeral where she wanted to be alone with Lacey and Connor for a couple of minutes, and how she sat by the casket and said that she knew that even though Lacey and Connor were together in that casket, that Lacey would have been wanting to hold her son, and she should have been holding her son, but she could not hold Connor because she didn't have any arms. Two female jurors began sobbing at this point, and one male juror had to cover his eyes with his hand, probably to hide the fact that he was tearing up a little as well. And as Sharon is crying at the front of the courtroom, talking about the daughter she would never hug again, talking about the grandson she would never get to hold, Scott Peterson is sitting there with his lawyers, smiling and laughing and not even really looking at her. He didn't even have the respect for these people who were clearly feeling so much pain and loss to even pretend to care that they were hurting. On December 9th, the last day of the penalty phase, Jackie Peterson gets up and begs the jury for her son's life. She says he's not the monster that the media has made him out to be. She said he's kind, he's gentle, he's nurturing, and he's mourning for his wife and his son. And then she said, if you kill Scott, it will be as if Lacey never existed. You would have wiped an entire family off the planet. And I honestly had to read this statement a couple of times to make sure I'd read correctly because I thought I can't have read that correctly. I received a couple comments on part 2 of the video that said I was too rough on Scott's parents, and I respectfully disagree with you. The reason Scott Peterson turned out the way he did was because his parents constantly made excuses for him his entire life. To cheat on your pregnant wife and have your parents publicly go on a national television show and say, this isn't anything that doesn't happen every day. It's not out of the ordinary. He didn't do anything, that 95% of the men out there aren't doing, is absolutely ridiculous and unacceptable as a parent. It shows me how Scott was raised. He was the golden child. He was placed on a pedestal. He could do no wrong. And if he did do anything wrong, his parents would make excuses for it. They would justify why he did something wrong or how it's okay that he did that wrong because that's what normal kids do. So you've raised a child who now thinks, even as an adult, that he can do no wrong, that the only person who matters is him. What he wants, what he desires, how he wants life to be is the only thing that matters. Scott Peterson is the main actor, and everyone around Scott Peterson in his life are just supporting characters who can be written out of the script. When you raise a child with so much entitlement and so little consequences, you put a monster into the world who believes that their own desires, their own feelings, what they want are so much more important than anything else. And I'm sorry if I offended somebody who feels that parents shouldn't be held accountable for the way their children turn out, but I believe that a lot of the times they are responsible for the way that their children turn out. And like I said, I'm sorry if you were offended by that, but I'm not sorry I said it because I believe that. Jackie Peterson says if you kill Scott, it will be as if Lacey never existed. Where do you get off, woman? Where does that come from? What are you talking about? As if the only thing that defined Laci Peterson was the fact that she was Scott's wife? As if Scott still breathing on this earth somehow keeps Laci's memory alive. And when he ceases to exist any longer, her memory will be gone? No, ma'am, I object. Laci's memory lives on in many people, hundreds, thousands, millions of people, her family, her friends, the people she knew and touched every day with her kindness and her love, the people she touched all over the world with the story of what happened to her and her son. Not in Scott Peterson. Never in Scott Peterson. On December 13th, the jury sentenced Scott Peterson to death by lethal injection, and the crowds outside of the courthouse cheered. Something I did not like, something I found to be incredibly distasteful, was when members of the jury walked outside after this and gave interviews to the media. And I'm always thinking about clips I'm going to put in to show you guys what happened. And then I'm like, well, I'm probably going to be demonetized for it and have some random network in South America claim my entire video. So should I even put this clip in? But I'm going to try to put the clip in, but I'm going to tell you, what was said. Two of the jurors were outside pretty much giving interviews, and one of them was like, it's illegal to kill your wife and son in California. And then the other one was like, San Quentin's your new home. It just seemed so lynch mobby, more like, a witch hunt or vindictive. It didn't seem to me like justice had been served. If I'm a juror, even if I know Scott Peterson is guilty and I just sentenced him to death, I'm not going to be elated about it. I'm not going to go outside and be like, yeah, we got him. He's about to die. Because regardless, he's still a person and a human being, and I just signed his death warrant. And that's a hard thing for a person to do. And if you value human life, you would still have a hard time doing that, even if you thought he murdered his wife.
He is a jerk, and I have one comment for Scott. You look somebody in the face when they're talking to you.
Well, Scott came in with a great big smile on his face, laughing. He's on his way home, Scott figures. Well, guess what, Scotty?
San Quentin's your new home.
And it's illegal to kill your wife and child in California.
And I didn't like that at all. Not at all. Scott is currently on death row at San Quentin Prison, which is north of San Francisco. On July 6th, 2012, Peterson's new attorney, Cliff Gardner, filed a 423-page appeal of Scott's sentence. He said there just isn't enough evidence there to convict him. There wasn't enough evidence there to convict him, and Scott should get a new trial. Gardner says the judge who proceeded over Scott's trial, who has since sadly passed away, made several mistakes and error in judgment. He dismissed dozens of jurors from the jury and the potential juror pool because they said they would be hesitant to convict somebody and hand them the death penalty. And Scott's lawyers think that these people should have been allowed to be on the jury, and they should have been asked, well, would you be willing to kind of change your mind based on the circumstances? But basically, they wanted people on the jury who were pro-death penalty. That's what Scott's lawyers are saying. They also said that the judge should have allowed an experiment that the defense did. And it was an experiment they got on video where they put a boat like Scott's in the water, and they put a man who was about Scott's size and height into the boat with a weighted mannequin, which would have been about Laci's weight. And they conducted the experiment where the man would try to throw the weighted mannequin out of the boat, but every time the boat would capsize. So the defense was trying to say that there was no way that Scott could have brought Laci in the boat out to the bay and dumped her over the side without capsizing the boat and himself in the process. Now, during the original trial, the judge said, I'm not allowing this video in because the man who's, pretending to be Scott Peterson is clearly, in my opinion, trying to tip this boat over. Additionally, this is not Scott Peterson's boat. This is a different boat, and it has a different center of gravity, so this experiment isn't really valid. But the judge did offer Mark Geragos to perform the same experiment with Scott Peterson's actual boat and with the prosecution and the judge looking on, and Geragos declined to do this, which tells me that the initial experiment was rigged to make it look like Scott would have overturned his boat and capsized himself into the water. So that's why he didn't want to redo the experiment. The appeal also stated that the use of sniffer dogs was equal to voodoo, that the dog's testimony wouldn't be allowed in court anyways, and it was like magic or voodoo. And the state responded back, the fact that Lacey and Connor were found very close by to where the dogs alerted would kind of tell you that the dogs know what they're doing. The defense then responded to the state's response to the initial plea and said that the sniffer dog who had sensed Lacey at the marina had failed 2/3 of their certification tests in similar situations and scenarios. And I just want to be like, get off of the sniffer dog thing, guys. Get off of it. The dogs sensed Lacey at the marina. They sniffed her out. She was found not far from there. It's over. Like, let it go. On top of that, the defense was already trying to say that Lacey had been at the marina days before she went missing. So it wouldn't have been that crazy if the dogs smelled her there if she'd been there. So what are you guys arguing? Are you arguing against your own argument that she'd been there? Like, oh, get off of the sniffer dog thing. Leave the dogs alone. Leave the dogs alone. In August of 2018, Scott's legal team filed their last of 6 written appeals, meaning if this doesn't work, it's his last shot, essentially. If this last appeal doesn't get him a new trial, he will be put to death. This new appeal places the blame of Scott's conviction firmly on Geragos' shoulders. At the beginning of Scott's initial trial, Geragos said there was dozens of witnesses who had seen Lacey on December 24th, and the jury was going to hear from them. But he never brought them up again, and he never brought them out to, talk to the jury or give their statements. So basically, Scott's new legal team is saying Geragos screwed up by bringing these eyewitnesses into, the beginning of the trial and saying he absolutely did not do it. And these witnesses will tell you they saw Lacey walking her dog on the 24th, the morning of the 24th, after Scott had left for his warehouse. But he never brought those eyewitnesses out to testify. So the jury kind of either didn't believe him or forgot about it. Then there was the stealth juror, Rochelle Nice. She's also known as Strawberry Shortcake because she has bright red hair. Scott is claiming she lied during her juror interview when she said she had never been the victim of a violent crime, when in fact she was 4 months pregnant and she had been physically assaulted by her boyfriend. According to Rochelle, this was a made-up ploy. It's all a lie. That never happened. She had filed a restraining order on her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend when she was pregnant, saying that she felt she and her baby were in danger, but that was because the ex-girlfriend was vandalizing her car and threatening her. And she said, I never would have been on a jury where I was going to judge a man for a crime that I've been a victim of myself. I don't know if I necessarily believe Strawberry Shortcake because she was one of the jurors who was being very vindictive when she was being interviewed by the media after the trial, where she was like, San Quentin's your new home, Scott. But also, when Scott arrived on death row, Rochelle Nice began to send him letters in prison, and he actually referred to her as his pen pal. And Rochelle's like, no, I was not his pen pal. I was just trying to get his point of view on the whole thing and hear his story because they didn't get to hear from him during the trial. And Rochelle was writing a book called We the Jury, so she wanted to get his input, I guess, for her book. Everybody's got to write a book. Rochelle claims in the letters Scott tries to flatter her and flirt with her almost, and it reminded her of how he dealt with Amber Fry, which skeeved her out, but she says, we're not pen pals, we're not friends. They're just trying to get his point of view. At this point, the appeal is still out there, and we are just going to have to wait and see what happens. Here's my opinion. Here's what I think. I think Scott Peterson did this. I think he did this. If he did not do this, he is the unluckiest person in the entire world. Because so many things add up to him doing this. And if they were all coincidences, like he explains, you have the worst luck ever. Ever. Scott Peterson, I believe, did this. I don't believe there was enough evidence in his trial to convict him and put him on death row. This is the same thing I felt about Casey Anthony. I 100% believe that Casey Anthony had something to do with her daughter Kaylee's death. She was found not guilty. And as pissed off as I was about that, as pissed off as everybody was about that, I still had to look at it in a way and say, if I was on that jury, would I have been able to convict her and give her the death penalty with the information and the evidence that the prosecution had? And it would have been no. I would have emotionally wanted to convict her because I know in my heart she had to have had something to do with it. However, logically, I could not have I believe Scott Peterson was convicted by a group of 12 people who already had come into the trial with preconceived notions, who were emotionally led by stories of Laci, seeing pictures of her, seeing the autopsy photos of her and Connor, hearing from Amber, hearing the calls that Scott made. I think they hated him as a person, and I believe that that did influence their decision in the end. I do think he probably should get another trial, but I don't think he will. And I do also believe, even if he does get another trial, he would still be found guilty because so many people think he did this. And even now, the case of Laci Peterson has become more widespread. So I don't know. I don't know, guys. Tell me what you think in the comments. This whole story is really sad because Laci Peterson and Connor Peterson are gone. Laci would have been an amazing mother. Connor would have been a lucky boy. The bond between mother and son is irreplaceable and unexplainable. I have a 7-year-old son and I call him my mini soulmate. I love him so, so, so much. And I'm so sad that Laci was robbed from that experience and that relationship, to be a mother, to have a son who would be a mama's boy, to have a son that she could cook for and bring with her out in the garden and teach him how to grow flowers, read to him at night, give him little stuffed animals for Valentine's Day, to receive Valentine's Day cards from him with little stick figures and, a little I love mom written in the hand of a 4-year-old. These are experiences that Laci will never have, that Connor will never have. It's very unlikely that anybody but Scott Peterson did this. Scott's attorneys have said that because it was so public where Scott went fishing that day, where they were checking the bay for Laci and Connor, that somebody else killed her and dumped her in the San Francisco Bay in order to frame Scott. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I'm sorry. I went into this with an open mind. I looked at every possible scenario. I put myself in Scott Peterson's shoes. And if he is not guilty, that small 1% chance that he's not guilty, if he's not, I feel really, really bad for him. But I think he is, guys. All right, so we're going to end this here. I hope this doesn't have to be broken into 2 parts because I feel like I've been recording for a really long time. Yes, I have. We'll see what happens. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind and stay beautiful. And I love you guys. Have a great day. Mwah. Bye.
Through the tears, the light is faded. As heavy hearts consume